Sometimes the most expensive rooms in the world reveal the cheapest hearts hiding inside them. The sprawling Carter estate sat high above Beverly Hills like a monument built entirely for people who had long forgotten what ordinary life looked like. $40 million of imported white stone glowing beneath the golden California sunset, while luxury cars worth more than suburban homes lined the circular driveway where valets moved quickly beneath towering palm trees wrapped in warm decorative lights. Inside the mansion itself, crystal chandeliers suspended nearly 20 feet above. Polished marble floors reflected thousands of fractured lights across walls decorated with original European artwork. Waiters moved silently through crowds carrying silver trays filled with imported champagne, while wealthy investors from Silicon Valley laughed beside Hollywood producers dressed in suits tailored so precisely they looked sculpted rather than worn, because tonight was not simply another elite gathering among California's untouchable upper class. Tonight marked the official engagement celebration of Ethan Carter, 38-year-old tech billionaire and founder of Carter Dynamics, one of the fastest-growing artificial intelligence companies in the country, a man whose face had appeared on magazine covers so often the financial world practically treated him like royalty. But while guests admired the six-figure floral arrangements surrounding the enormous glass staircase curving through the center of the mansion, unnoticed by almost everyone near the service entrance, a very different world quietly moved through the shadows, keeping this glamorous illusion alive. Helen Dawson adjusted the cuff of her simple black housekeeping uniform while balancing a silver serving tray against one tired arm, years of hard work visible in the small movements people like billionaires rarely noticed. And walking carefully beside her carrying folded linen napkins was her daughter Emily Dawson, 24 years old, soft blonde hair loosely tied back, pale blue eyes gentle but observant, wearing a simple light beige cotton dress bought 3 weeks earlier from a discount store after Helen insisted tonight's event might finally help Emily make useful professional connections despite knowing money had become painfully scarce these past few years. The modest dress fit well enough, but inside a mansion overflowing with designer gowns worth $10,000 or more, it may as well have announced poverty out loud to everyone standing nearby. Still, Emily said nothing while quietly helping arrange glasses near the grand dining hall, because dignity had taught her long ago that life did not become easier simply because you wished circumstances were different. Across the room, laughter erupted around a cluster of wealthy socialites discussing luxury European vacations, while outside the floor-to-ceiling windows Los Angeles city lights stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Helen leaned closer and whispered softly without looking directly at her daughter, "Thank you for helping tonight, sweetheart. I know this is not exactly how most girls your age want to spend Saturday evenings." Emily smiled faintly while setting the final glass into perfect alignment beneath the Victoria Sinclair did not speak immediately, and somehow that silence felt far more dangerous than the cheerful laughter still drifting carelessly through the enormous Beverly Hills mansion around them. Because standing near the center staircase beneath layers of imported crystal light, she had already locked onto Emily Dawson with the focused expression of someone mentally sorting human beings into categories long before opening her mouth: expensive or worthless, valuable or invisible, acceptable or beneath notice. And exactly 3 seconds later, the corners of Victoria's perfectly painted lips slowly lifted into something dangerously close to amusement as she stepped away from the small cluster of wealthy socialites surrounding her. Silver designer heels clicking sharply against polished Italian marble loud enough that both Helen and Emily instinctively looked upward at the approaching figure. Nearby conversations softened almost immediately, because even among California's elite, Victoria carried a reputation everyone understood well enough to recognize: beautiful, privileged, and absolutely aware of how much power came attached to becoming the future wife of billionaire Ethan Carter. She stopped directly in front of Emily and allowed her eyes to travel slowly downward with theatrical exaggeration, from the loose blonde hair tied carelessly behind Emily's neck to the simple beige cotton dress falling just below her knees, then toward the inexpensive white flats clearly worn enough to reveal tiny creases across the sides. And suddenly Victoria let out a sharp laugh loud enough that at least a dozen nearby guests instinctively turned toward the sound. "Oh my God," she said while folding one perfectly manicured arm across her waist and gesturing openly toward Emily as if displaying something amusing at an art gallery. "Would everyone please look at this for 1 second?" Several investors paused conversations immediately while 2 women holding champagne glasses exchanged uncertain glances and stepped closer out of curiosity. Emily remained perfectly still beside the dining table, though a faint tension instantly moved through her shoulders while Helen visibly stiffened, standing only inches away now. Victoria tilted her head slightly and smiled wider, except nothing about the expression carried warmth. "I honestly cannot decide what surprises me more," she said. Loudly enough now that the surrounding laughter throughout the ballroom had begun fading almost entirely. The fact that someone thought this was appropriate attire for a private engagement celebration, or the fact that she apparently looked in a mirror and said, "Yes, this works." A few nervous chuckles slipped awkwardly from two younger socialites standing nearby, though most guests remained silent now. Sensing discomfort spreading rapidly through the center of the room, Helen immediately stepped forward, clutching the silver tray tighter against trembling fingers, and lowered her head respectfully the way years of service had conditioned her to do automatically whenever wealthy people grew irritated. "Miss Sinclair, I apologize, Emily is only helping me for the evening. I thought perhaps—" But Victoria lifted one finger, sharply cutting her off without even turning toward her. Eyes still locked entirely on Emily, as if Helen herself barely existed. "I was not speaking to you." The words landed with brutal coldness and Helen instantly fell silent, humiliation flashing visibly across her tired face. But what Victoria failed to notice while enjoying the power of the moment was a tall figure standing quietly near the second-floor balcony overlooking the ballroom below. Ethan Carter had just stepped away from a private investor conversation after hearing the sudden shift in atmosphere beneath him, and now leaning one hand lightly against the polished railing above. The billionaire watched silently as the woman he intended to marry smiled directly at a young woman who had done absolutely nothing wrong except exist in clothing Victoria personally considered too cheap to deserve respect. For several heavy seconds after Victoria Sinclair silenced Helen with that single dismissive gesture, the entire atmosphere inside the Carter estate began shifting in a way few guests fully understood yet. Because what had started only moments earlier as another glamorous Beverly Hills engagement celebration filled with luxury watches, designer gowns, venture capital executives, and champagne imported directly from France had now transformed into something painfully uncomfortable. Hanging in the center of the ballroom beneath the enormous crystal chandelier overhead, but standing directly in front of Victoria, Emily Dawson remained surprisingly calm despite the humiliation clearly directed toward her from every angle. Her pale blue eyes lowered briefly toward the polished marble floor while fingers tightened quietly around the folded linen napkin still resting in her hands, and though the flush rising softly against her cheeks revealed embarrassment, what stood out most was the fact that she never stepped backward. She did not shrink, she did not collapse beneath the weight of cruel laughter the way Victoria clearly expected her to. Instead, she simply remained standing with a quiet dignity that somehow unsettled the surrounding crowd far more than any public argument would have. Beside her, Helen immediately tried stepping forward again despite the visible humiliation already written across, years of exhaustion etched into her face. "Miss Sinclair, please. I truly did not think there would be any problem tonight. Emily only came because I needed help with extra service staff and I—" But once again Victoria did not allow her to finish, this time rolling her eyes dramatically before letting out another amused laugh while several nearby guests shifted uncomfortably, holding untouched champagne glasses between nervous fingers. "Helen, honestly," Victoria said with thinly disguised contempt, "you have worked in this house long enough to understand basic standards. This is not some public grocery store or discount diner where people wear whatever they find buried inside clearance bins." The sentence landed brutally enough that even one older investor standing near the staircase visibly frowned while pretending sudden interest in the artwork hanging behind him. Helen lowered her head immediately and Emily finally looked upward, not angry, not defensive, simply watching Victoria with an expression so composed it almost seemed strangely mature against the cruelty unfolding around her. And that quiet composure somehow irritated Victoria even more because arrogance feeds on visible weakness and Emily was refusing to provide it. Victoria stepped closer, now lowering her voice just enough to sound more intimate while ensuring everyone nearby could still hear every word clearly. "I mean seriously, look around you." She extended one jeweled hand slowly toward the ballroom where women stood wearing custom gowns costing more than most people earned in 6 months while polished luxury watches gleamed beneath warm golden light reflecting across imported Italian marble. Then her eyes returned sharply toward Emily's modest beige dress and the faint mocking smile widened further. "Do you honestly think people like you belong in rooms like this? Silence spread instantly through the nearest cluster of guests, nobody laughing now, nobody speaking, because even among the wealthy there remained an invisible line separating confidence from cruelty, and Victoria had clearly crossed it without hesitation. But what she failed to realize was that 30 feet above the ballroom, standing near the second-floor balcony, Ethan Carter had not moved once since overhearing the confrontation begin, his sharp blue eyes fixed entirely on the young blonde woman below, who, despite being publicly humiliated inside one of the most expensive homes in California, still somehow carried herself with more grace than nearly anyone attending the party built in his honor. And for the very first time that evening the billionaire found himself looking less at what Emily Dawson was wearing and far more at the woman standing beside him, wondering how he had somehow failed to notice exactly who Victoria Sinclair had become. For nearly 5 full seconds after Victoria Sinclair asked whether people like Emily Dawson belonged in rooms like this, the grand ballroom remained trapped inside a silence so heavy it seemed to press downward from the enormous crystal chandelier hanging above them, because even among Beverly Hills elite accustomed to wealth dividing people into invisible categories, there remained an unspoken understanding that certain thoughts were never meant to be said aloud so openly. But Victoria stood perfectly comfortable in the center of the room, wearing a shimmering silver designer gown that reflected warm golden light across polished marble floors, entirely unaware that each word leaving her lips had begun quietly dismantling something far more valuable than the glamorous engagement celebration built around her tonight. Beside Emily, Helen Dawson physically stiffened as though years of professional discipline were the only thing preventing visible heartbreak from reaching her face. She immediately stepped forward, lowering her eyes once again with the familiar exhausted humility of someone who had spent more than a decade learning survival often required swallowing pride in silence. "Miss Sinclair, please do not blame Emily for this," Helen said softly while clutching the silver serving tray so tightly her knuckles turned pale against the polished metal. "I was the one who asked her to come help me tonight because 2 service employees called out sick earlier and I did not want your event to suffer because of staffing shortages." But instead of appreciating the explanation, Victoria let out another amused breath and slowly folded both perfectly manicured arms against her waist, expensive diamond bracelet glimmering beneath the chandelier, while the faint smile across her lips sharpened into visible contempt. "You really are missing the point entirely, Helen," she said coolly while shifting her eyes back toward Emily standing motionless beside her mother. "This is exactly why certain people remain stuck where they are in life. Nobody teaches them how appearances work. Image matters. Presentation matters. If you walk into environments above your level looking like that, people immediately know where you belong." Several nearby guests now visibly looked uncomfortable enough to begin stepping away in small cautious movements. An older venture capitalist standing near the staircase quietly lowered his champagne glass without taking another sip, while 2 younger women dressed in luxury couture exchanged awkward glances, clearly regretting remaining close enough to hear the conversation unfold. But standing directly beside Helen, something inside Emily finally shifted, because although embarrassment still warmed her cheeks, she had watched her mother absorb enough humiliation for one evening already. Slowly and deliberately she stepped 1 foot forward, placing herself subtly between Helen and Victoria in a movement so instinctive it caught everyone nearby off guard. Helen immediately looked up in surprise while Emily lifted her chin slightly and for the first time met Victoria's gaze directly, not with anger, not with hostility, simply with the calm, steady confidence of someone who had spent years learning self-respect could survive circumstances money never touched. And 30 feet above the ballroom, Ethan Carter leaned slightly farther against the second-floor balcony railing, his sharp blue eyes narrowing almost imperceptibly as he watched the young woman below move protectively in front of her mother, despite standing in a room filled entirely with people wealthier and more powerful than she could ever imagine. Victoria noticed the movement instantly and tilted her head with visible amusement, as though enjoying the possibility of further conflict. But what she did not yet understand was that in less than 30 seconds she was about to witness something far more dangerous than public embarrassment, because while she believed she had cornered the weakest person in the room, Ethan Carter had begun quietly realizing the woman standing below in the cheap dress possessed more natural dignity than the woman wearing the anga. The subtle movement Emily Dawson made when stepping protectively in front of her mother shifted something almost imperceptible in the atmosphere of the grand ballroom. Because until that exact second everyone watching had unconsciously assumed the young woman standing in the simple beige cotton dress would respond the same way most ordinary people did when confronted publicly by someone wealthy enough to destroy reputations with a single phone call. They expected tears, silence, retreat, visible shame, but instead Emily simply stood there with shoulders straight and pale blue eyes calm enough that several nearby guests immediately stopped pretending not to watch, and standing directly in front of her Victoria Sinclair seemed almost irritated by the complete absence of fear she had clearly hoped to provoke. She tilted her head slightly and allowed another sharp smile to spread across her perfectly composed face while slowly circling one hand toward Emily as though presenting evidence supporting some private argument only she understood. Interesting, Victoria said loudly enough that even conversations near the far end of the ballroom had now almost completely disappeared. You know what amazes me about girls like you? She paused dramatically while several wealthy guests exchanged uncomfortable glances around untouched crystal champagne glasses reflecting warm chandelier light across polished Italian marble. Then Victoria laughed softly and continued with open contempt. No matter how obvious reality becomes, somehow you always convince yourselves dignity can compensate for limitations life already assigned you. Helen immediately inhaled sharply beside her daughter, visibly shaken now, but Emily remained still, and though embarrassment still touched the edges of her expression there was something stronger now quietly replacing it, resolve. Victoria noticed instantly and stepped closer, lowering her voice enough to sound almost conversational while ensuring every person standing nearby still heard every word clearly. Let me guess, she continued while briefly glancing toward Emily's inexpensive flats. Before looking upward again, you probably tell yourself that working hard and staying humble somehow makes people respect you, but unfortunately society does not work that way, sweetheart. Certain doors only open for people born into the right world. The cruelty behind the statement was so casually delivered that several investors standing near the staircase physically turned away, now unwilling to remain connected to what had become something deeply unpleasant unfolding in public. But 30 feet above the ballroom Ethan Carter remained motionless against the second-floor balcony rail, his sharp blue eyes fixed entirely on Victoria now. Except what unsettled him most was not simply the cruelty itself, it was how natural it sounded. There had been no hesitation in her voice, no emotional reaction, no temporary frustration creating an isolated lapse in judgment. This was familiarity, this was belief, this was the genuine worldview of the woman he had spent nearly 3 years preparing to marry. Below him Emily slowly exhaled and finally spoke for the first time that evening. Her voice soft enough that the room instinctively leaned inward to hear, but steady enough to carry an authority nobody expected from someone Victoria had spent 10 straight minutes reducing publicly. My mother has worked harder in 1 week than many people spend their entire lives understanding. The sentence landed immediately and Helen looked toward her daughter with visible surprise while Victoria's smile faded almost instantly, but Emily continued without raising her voice once. Pale eyes locked directly forward now with a quiet dignity far stronger than anger, and I learned something very important from watching her. Another pause. Complete silence. Then Emily finished with words that would remain in Ethan Carter's mind far longer than anyone in the ballroom understood yet. The value of a person is never measured by what they wear, only by how they make other people feel when nobody powerful is watching. And standing above the room hearing that sentence, Ethan Carter suddenly realized he had just witnessed 2 women reveal exactly who they truly were within the same 10-minute conversation, and only one of them deserved his respect. For several long seconds after Emily Dawson finished speaking, the grand ballroom stood frozen beneath the towering crystal chandelier, but this silence felt completely different from the earlier discomfort Victoria Sinclair had created, because now the stillness carried weight. The kind that settles over a room when truth arrives so unexpectedly direct that nobody knows how to respond without exposing something uncomfortable about themselves. Dozens of wealthy investors stood motionless, holding untouched champagne glasses while warm California light from the massive floor-to-ceiling windows reflected across polished marble beneath their expensive shoes, and standing directly in front of Emily, Victoria stared with an expression that had begun shifting rapidly from amusement into something far sharper. Because for perhaps the first time in years someone she considered socially invisible had not only refused humiliation but had answered with a dignity powerful enough to make half the room question who truly belonged there. Helen Dawson stood speechless beside her daughter now, pale fingers still wrapped tightly around the silver serving tray while pride slowly replaced the shame that had been forced onto her only moments earlier. But 30 feet above the ballroom, Ethan Carter had already stepped away from the balcony railing and was now walking quietly through the private upper hallway leading toward the staff management office tucked behind the West Wing staircase. His polished black dress shoes moving in calm deliberate rhythm against dark hardwood flooring while something far heavier than irritation had begun forming inside his chest, because after hearing Victoria speak so naturally about social worth as though humanity itself could somehow be measured by bank accounts and designer labels, he no longer trusted what he thought he understood about the woman waiting downstairs wearing the engagement ring he had given her 3 months ago, less than 60 seconds later. He pushed open the narrow office door where Daniel Mercer, the estate operations manager responsible for all household staffing logistics, immediately stood upright from behind a computer screen, visibly startled by the unexpected appearance of his employer. Ethan wasted no time and kept his voice low but precise enough that Daniel understood immediately this was not casual conversation. "Tell me about Helen Dawson." Daniel blinked once before answering carefully. "Helen has worked this property nearly 12 years, sir. Never missed scheduled shifts unless family emergencies forced leave. Extremely reliable." Ethan nodded once. "And Emily?" Daniel hesitated briefly while searching internal employee records already open on the monitor before looking upward again. "Not officially employed here, sir. Helen occasionally brings her for temporary event assistance. From what I know, Emily had to leave university several years ago after her father suffered a severe stroke. She works evenings at Westwood Books downtown and helps cover medical expenses while assisting her mother whenever extra money is needed." Ethan said nothing, but the information landed heavily because somehow everything he had witnessed downstairs now carried far greater meaning than simple public humiliation. Victoria had not mocked someone careless or entitled, she had chosen to publicly degrade a young woman sacrificing her own future simply to help hold her struggling family together. Daniel noticed the silence stretching awkwardly and quietly added one final detail while lowering his voice instinctively. "For what it is worth, sir, Helen has never once accepted financial assistance even when we privately offered support after her husband became ill. Pride means everything to that family." Ethan slowly turned toward the office doorway now, sharp blue eyes colder than before but carrying something entirely new beneath the surface. Respect, because somewhere inside the extravagant mansion downstairs filled with people measuring worth through money and status, he had just discovered the strongest person in the building might be the woman standing in the cheapest dress. And at that exact moment back inside the ballroom, Victoria Sinclair was smiling again, completely unaware that the man she intended to marry had already begun seeing her very differently than he ever had before. Back inside the grand ballroom, the atmosphere had not fully recovered from the confrontation that had unfolded only minutes earlier, but unlike before when Victoria Sinclair stood confidently at the center of attention controlling every glance directed toward her, something subtle had changed now. The laughter had not returned. Conversations remained fragmented in uneasy clusters around the marble floor while expensive champagne glasses sat untouched atop polished silver trays as though the entire celebration itself had somehow lost momentum. But Victoria either failed to notice or simply refused to acknowledge the shift because standing near the center staircase beneath the massive chandelier she once again turned her attention toward Emily Dawson with the unmistakable expression of someone determined to reclaim dominance after unexpectedly losing control of a public moment. Helen Dawson quietly leaned closer toward her daughter and whispered under her breath without lifting her eyes, "Emily, maybe we should leave before this gets worse." But Emily did not answer immediately because years of watching her mother sacrifice everything for their family had taught her one lesson more powerful than fear: running from cruelty only teaches cruel people they deserve obedience. And before either woman could move, Victoria suddenly stepped forward once again, silver designer heels striking the marble sharply enough to silence the few remaining conversations still floating through the room. She folded both arms across her waist and smiled with a cold confidence that instantly signaled trouble to every guest watching nearby. "You know what I find fascinating?" she asked while slowly scanning Emily from head to toe again, though this time irritation had begun replacing amusement inside her voice. "Girls from struggling backgrounds always pretend humility makes them admirable when in reality most of them are simply waiting for opportunities to escape through someone else's success. The accusation landed harshly enough that an older woman standing beside the wine table physically turned away in visible discomfort while two younger investors exchanged stunned expressions. But Victoria continued speaking as though entirely convinced the room still belonged to her. She gestured vaguely toward the massive mansion surrounding them where imported artwork lined cathedral-height walls and floor-to-ceiling glass revealed sweeping Beverly Hills lights stretching endlessly outside. "I have seen this pattern too many times," she said sharply now, a pretty face, a carefully crafted innocent personality, a tragic family story, and suddenly wealthy men start confusing pity with admiration. The words hung brutally in the air because everyone understood exactly where the accusation pointed now. Helen immediately inhaled sharply beside Emily while color visibly drained from her exhausted face. But what Victoria did not realize was that at that exact moment Ethan Carter had quietly re-entered the ballroom from the west hallway and now stood partially hidden behind one of the enormous white marble support columns near the rear entrance, his sharp blue eyes fixed entirely on Victoria. While Daniel Mercer's words still echoed clearly inside his mind, 12 years of loyal service, university sacrificed, father recovering from stroke, refusing financial help despite hardship. And suddenly hearing Victoria reduce all of that struggle into some manipulative strategy for gaining access to wealthy men triggered something Ethan had not expected to feel tonight, disappointment deeper than anger itself, because standing here now watching the woman he intended to marry casually attack someone whose entire life had been defined by sacrifice rather than entitlement, he realized the divide between Victoria and Emily extended far beyond money. One woman had inherited privilege and learned arrogance while the other had inherited struggle and somehow still chose grace, and as Victoria prepared to continue humiliating Emily in front of 200 silent witnesses, Ethan Carter finally understood with absolute certainty that tonight was no longer about protecting an engagement celebration. It was about deciding exactly what kind of person deserved standing beside him in the future he had spent his entire life building. The final sentence Victoria Sinclair delivered lingered heavily beneath the towering crystal chandeliers like a poison slowly spreading through the grand Beverly Hills ballroom, because by now there was no confusion left among the 200 guests surrounding the confrontation. This was no accidental misunderstanding born from temporary frustration. This was deliberate cruelty delivered by someone so deeply conditioned by privilege that compassion itself had become secondary to maintaining social hierarchy. And standing only a few feet away, Emily Dawson quietly absorbed every word without moving while Helen beside her looked visibly shaken enough that the silver serving tray trembling lightly in her hands reflected fractured light across the polished marble floor below. But what Victoria failed to recognize while savoring the control she believed still belonged entirely to her was that the room itself had already begun turning against her. Wealthy investors near the bar no longer concealed their discomfort. One middle-aged venture capitalist quietly whispered something sharp enough to make his wife immediately shake her head in disbelief, while two younger women wearing couture gowns deliberately stepped farther away from the center staircase as though physically distancing themselves from the ugliness unfolding publicly in front of them. But Victoria remained too consumed by jealousy now to notice any of it because across the room her eyes had caught something far more alarming than social discomfort. Ethan Carter had returned, and though partially obscured beside one of the marble support columns near the rear entrance, she immediately recognized where his attention had settled. Not on her, not on the investors, not on the celebration collapsing around them, but directly on Emily. And suddenly something dangerous twisted beneath Victoria's perfect composure because for the first time all evening she realized Ethan had witnessed far more than she originally assumed. She straightened immediately and stepped even closer toward Emily now, expensive silver heels clicking sharply against marble as irritation fully replaced elegance inside her voice. "Now I understand," she said coldly while folding both arms tightly against the shimmering designer fabric hugging her waist. "This entire performance finally makes sense." Emily frowned slightly though remained silent while Helen instinctively moved closer beside her daughter. Victoria laughed bitterly and continued loud enough for every guest nearby to hear clearly. "I was wondering why Ethan suddenly looked interested in this ridiculous little drama, but of course I should have seen it sooner." She pointed openly toward Emily now, no longer pretending sophistication mattered. "Girls like you always know exactly what you are doing. You create sympathy, stand there pretending innocence, wear cheap clothes so people feel sorry for you, and wait for wealthy men to confuse pity with admiration. The accusation struck the room like shattered glass because now even guests standing 20 feet away visibly reacted. A quiet gasp escaped somewhere near the grand piano while one older woman set down her champagne, entirely unable to hide disgust crossing her expression. Helen immediately stepped forward, opening her mouth to defend her daughter, but Emily gently touched her mother's arm, stopping her before another humiliation could land. And standing across the ballroom, Ethan Carter finally straightened fully from the marble column where he had been silently watching everything unfold, his sharp blue eyes now colder than anyone present had ever seen before, because in less than 15 minutes Victoria Sinclair had somehow managed to expose something infinitely uglier than arrogance. She had revealed a worldview built entirely on contempt for people who struggled honestly, and as Ethan began walking slowly toward the center of the ballroom, each measured step echoing softly across polished marble floors beneath absolute silence, nobody in the mansion yet understood that the engagement celebration they arrived expecting to remember for romance was about to become remembered for something far more permanent. The exact moment a billionaire decided the woman wearing the most expensive dress in the room was no longer worthy of standing beside him ever again. The sound of Ethan Carter's polished dress shoes moving steadily across the marble floor immediately changed the energy inside the ballroom more effectively than any announcement ever could, because among the wealthy elite gathered beneath the towering crystal chandeliers there existed one universal understanding that transcended money itself. When Ethan Carter moved with that level of quiet intention, people paid attention. Conversations that had already weakened during Victoria Sinclair's increasingly cruel public accusations now disappeared entirely until the only sounds remaining came from the soft hum of distant air conditioning and the faint clink of untouched champagne glasses trembling slightly in uncertain hands. Victoria herself immediately turned after hearing the unmistakable rhythm of his approach, and within seconds the confidence written across her expression shifted into visible relief, because she still believed the billionaire walking toward her intended to defend their engagement celebration and restore the control she felt slipping away. She smiled quickly and brushed one loose strand of dark hair behind her shoulder before speaking in a softer voice carefully designed for Ethan alone, though the entire room still heard every word. "Thank God you are finally here," she said while gesturing dismissively toward Emily Dawson standing quietly beside Helen near the dining hall entrance. "I have been trying to handle this embarrassing situation before it ruins the evening, but apparently some people cannot understand basic boundaries." Ethan did not answer immediately and continued walking until he stood directly between Victoria and Emily, close enough now that everyone present instinctively leaned forward, sensing something irreversible approaching. Victoria smiled again, expecting agreement, but Ethan never looked at her. Instead, his sharp blue eyes shifted briefly toward Helen, whose exhausted face still carried traces of humiliation, then toward Emily standing beside her with quiet composure despite enduring nearly 20 minutes of relentless public degradation, and something inside him hardened permanently, because after learning what sacrifices this family had endured, the cruelty Victoria displayed no longer felt disappointing, it felt unforgivable. But before Ethan could speak, Victoria mistook his silence for hesitation and stepped closer, placing one hand lightly against his arm while lowering her voice into the familiar intimate tone she had perfected over years of manipulating social situations to her advantage. "Ethan, honestly, I know this looks dramatic, but women like that know exactly how to exploit wealthy environments. Trust me, I have seen this type before." The sentence had barely finished leaving her lips before Emily Dawson finally moved. For the first time since Ethan entered the scene, she slowly stepped forward beside her mother, and though her cheeks still carried the faint color of lingering embarrassment, there was now something remarkably calm behind her pale blue eyes. Strength sharpened quietly through years of struggle most people in this room could never imagine surviving. She looked directly toward Victoria and spoke with such measured control that the silence somehow deepened even further around them. "You keep talking about people like me as though struggle automatically makes someone dishonest." Victoria immediately opened her mouth, but Emily continued before interruption could come, her voice never rising once. "I work evenings at a bookstore 6 nights every week. I left university because my father needed medical care after suffering a stroke. My mother works here because she has spent 12 years doing honest work to keep our family standing. We did not ask anyone in this room for sympathy, and we certainly did not come here looking for rescue." Several guests visibly lowered their eyes, now unable to comfortably meet her gaze, But Emily was not finished, and for the first time all evening Victoria Sinclair found herself standing opposite someone whose dignity refused intimidation entirely. "You think poverty teaches people how to manipulate," Emily said quietly while holding Victoria's stare without hesitation, "but sometimes privilege teaches people something much worse. It teaches them to mistake cruelty for superiority." Somewhere near the back of the ballroom a sharp intake of breath broke the silence, and standing directly beside Victoria, Ethan Carter finally turned his head slowly toward the woman wearing the diamond engagement ring he had given her 3 months ago, except the expression in his cold blue eyes no longer held affection, and everyone watching suddenly understood the night had just crossed the point where nothing would ever return to normal again. For several suspended seconds after Emily Dawson finished speaking, the entire ballroom seemed to forget how movement worked, because her final sentence had not simply answered Victoria Sinclair's accusations, it had dismantled the entire illusion of superiority Victoria had spent the evening wearing as confidently as the silver designer gown draped perfectly against her frame. Beneath the towering crystal chandeliers 200 elite guests stood completely silent now while warm Beverly Hills light filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the distant city skyline. Nobody touched the champagne glasses resting in nervous hands, and nobody dared interrupt what everyone instinctively understood had become the defining moment of the evening. Victoria herself stared toward Emily with visible disbelief flashing rapidly beneath her polished expression, because nowhere in her carefully constructed worldview had she prepared for someone she considered socially insignificant to speak with greater confidence than anyone else inside the mansion. But standing directly between both women, Ethan Carter had finally reached the exact point where silence no longer felt responsible. Slowly and deliberately he turned fully toward Victoria, and for the first time in nearly 3 years she saw something in his sharp blue eyes she had never imagined seeing directed at her, disappointment so absolute it carried no trace of affection beneath it. She forced a nervous laugh and instinctively reached for his arm again, attempting to reclaim control before the crowd surrounding them interpreted his expression correctly. "Ethan, do not look at me like that," she said quickly while lowering her voice, though the room remained quiet enough for everyone to hear every word clearly. "I was only protecting this event. People like them take advantage of generosity all the time, and I was trying to stop unnecessary embarrassment before things became complicated." Ethan slowly lowered his gaze toward the hand resting against his tailored black tuxedo sleeve, and without speaking he gently removed her fingers one by one before stepping half a pace away. The movement itself was so calm and restrained that somehow it felt infinitely heavier than anger ever could have. Victoria immediately froze while several investors near the staircase exchanged stunned expressions, realizing exactly what they had just witnessed. Ethan finally spoke, and though his voice remained low, every word carried sharply across the polished marble ballroom with absolute precision. "Do you understand what I have learned tonight?" Victoria opened her mouth, but he continued before interruption could come, never raising his voice once. "I learned that I invited 200 successful people into this home, believing tonight represented the beginning of a future built on trust, partnership, and shared values." He slowly turned his head toward Emily and Helen standing nearby, then looked back toward Victoria again, expression colder now than anyone present had ever seen from the billionaire normally known for calm discipline in every public setting. "Instead, I discovered that the woman I intended to spend my life with can stand in front of a hardworking mother and daughter who have sacrificed everything for their family and somehow reduce them to objects worthy only of ridicule because their bank account does not match your expectations." Victoria's face had gone pale now, but Ethan continued relentlessly, every sentence stripping away the authority she believed protected her moments earlier. "I asked Daniel Mercer about Helen and Emily before walking back into this room." That sentence struck instantly, and Victoria's eyes widened slightly while Helen beside Emily looked visibly startled. Hearing Ethan knew their story already, the billionaire took one final step backward, creating unmistakable distance between himself and Victoria before finishing with words so devastatingly calm the silence around them deepened even further. "You spent 20 minutes humiliating a woman who gave up university to support her sick father and help the mother who has served this house loyally for 12 years, and somehow you believed your behavior represented class." He paused, looked directly into Victoria's eyes, then quietly said the words nobody in the ballroom would ever forget. "The only thing cheap I have seen tonight was not Emily Dawson's dress, Victoria, it was your character." The moment Ethan Carter finished speaking, it felt as though every molecule of air inside the massive Beverly Hills estate had frozen in place, because among the 200 elite investors, executives, celebrities, and luxury socialites gathered beneath the towering crystal chandeliers, nobody had ever witnessed the billionaire publicly dismantle another person with such devastating calm. And standing directly across from him, Victoria Sinclair no longer resembled the perfectly composed woman who had spent the last half-hour weaponizing wealth as a tool for humiliation. The confidence that once sharpened every word leaving her lips had evaporated completely now, replaced by pale disbelief spreading visibly across her face, while the enormous diamond engagement ring resting on her left hand suddenly seemed heavier than anything she had ever worn. For several seconds she simply stared at Ethan as though waiting for him to smile and reveal this entire confrontation had somehow been a misunderstanding. But when his cold blue eyes remained completely unchanged, panic finally began breaking through her carefully maintained composure. "Ethan, you cannot be serious right now," she whispered sharply while instinctively stepping closer, her silver gown shimmering beneath fractured chandelier light. "You are humiliating me in front of everyone over this?" She pointed suddenly toward Emily and Helen standing quietly several feet away, as though still convinced their existence itself justified every cruel word she had spoken earlier. But Ethan did not move, did not soften, did not rescue her from the social collapse beginning around her. Victoria shook her head quickly and forced an increasingly unstable laugh while scanning nearby guests as though expecting someone to support her interpretation of events. But nobody moved, nobody spoke, and the silence surrounding her now felt infinitely more brutal than the silence she had forced Emily to endure only minutes earlier. "I was protecting your reputation," Victoria continued desperately, her voice losing elegance now. "You are one of the most powerful men in California, Ethan. People watch everything around you. You cannot seriously expect me to apologize for maintaining standards." That sentence destroyed whatever microscopic doubt still remained inside Ethan Carter, because hearing her repeat the same worldview even now after witnessing the damage she had caused only confirmed what he had already accepted internally. This was not temporary cruelty born from stress, this was identity. Slowly he exhaled once and without breaking eye contact reached calmly toward Victoria's left hand. At first she seemed confused by the movement, but within seconds realization flashed across her expression too late to stop what came next. Ethan gently held her wrist and with measured deliberate control slid the diamond engagement ring free from her trembling finger. The sound of several shocked gasps immediately broke through the ballroom from every direction, because now even the most distant guests understood exactly what was happening. Victoria physically stepped backward, staring down at her suddenly bare hand in disbelief so complete she looked almost disconnected from reality itself. Ethan lowered his hand and closed his fingers around the ring before speaking one final time, his voice still calm enough to feel almost merciless. "I spent years believing success meant surrounding myself with people who understood ambition, discipline, and vision." His gaze remained fixed entirely on her while every person present listened without breathing. "Tonight I learned something far more valuable. Money can buy elegance, luxury can create appearances, but neither can manufacture decency." Victoria's eyes widened further as tears of humiliation finally threatened to surface, but Ethan continued without hesitation. "I will not build a future beside someone who believes human worth can be measured by financial status." Another long silence followed before he delivered the final irreversible sentence that shattered the engagement celebration permanently. "This relationship ends here, Victoria." Somewhere behind him Helen Dawson quietly covered her mouth in stunned disbelief, while beside her Emily stood frozen, entirely speechless. And as Victoria Sinclair looked around the ballroom searching desperately for sympathy among 200 silent witnesses, she finally experienced the same truth she had refused to understand all evening: status disappears instantly the moment character fails. No one moved for what felt like an impossibly long stretch of time after Ethan Carter's final words settled across the ballroom, because the elegant Beverly Hills estate that had been carefully prepared to celebrate the beginning of a powerful union had now become the stage for something entirely different: the public collapse of a relationship everyone assumed represented perfection. Victoria Sinclair remained frozen beneath the towering crystal chandelier, pale fingers trembling slightly at her side while staring toward the empty space on her hand where the diamond engagement ring had rested only seconds earlier. But unlike earlier when sympathy instinctively surrounded her because of status and beauty, Now the silence pressing in from every direction felt cold and isolating. The same isolation she had forced onto Helen and Emily only moments before. Without another word, Victoria slowly stepped backward, silver designer gown catching fragments of chandelier light as tears of humiliation finally broke through the perfect social mask she had spent years constructing. Several guests immediately turned away, pretending not to notice, while others quietly exchanged glances carrying expressions somewhere between disbelief and quiet approval. But Ethan no longer looked at her because the emotional weight inside his chest had already shifted elsewhere. He turned slowly toward Helen Dawson first, and for the first time that evening the steel inside his expression softened noticeably. Helen instinctively lowered her eyes the way years of service had trained her to react whenever standing before employers with far greater power, but Ethan immediately spoke before old habits could deepen the invisible divide between them. "Helen, look at me please." The words were calm yet direct enough that Helen slowly lifted her exhausted face, still visibly shaken by everything unfolding around her. Ethan took one small step closer and his voice lowered, carrying none of the authority he used moments earlier with Victoria. "I owe you an apology." The sentence alone caused several nearby guests to visibly react because men in Ethan Carter's world rarely apologized publicly, especially not to household employees standing far below their economic status. Helen immediately shook her head instinctively, but Ethan continued before she could interrupt. "You have given 12 years of loyal service to this estate, and tonight, instead of gratitude, you were forced to endure humiliation inside a home where you deserved respect." Helen's eyes immediately filled with emotion. She had spent years learning how to hide behind professionalism, but Ethan turned next toward Emily Dawson and for several quiet seconds simply looked at her, except now he no longer saw the inexpensive beige dress Victoria had mocked so cruelly. He saw sacrifice, resilience, dignity forged through hardship without bitterness attached to it, and somehow that realization affected him more deeply than he expected. He reached into the inside pocket of his black tuxedo jacket and slowly removed a cream-colored business card embossed with the Carter Foundation insignia across elegant silver lettering. Extending it toward Emily carefully, he spoke in the same quiet tone, now carrying unmistakable sincerity. "Daniel explained your situation to me upstairs. I understand you left university because your family needed support." Emily hesitated before accepting the card, while confusion mixed with lingering disbelief across her soft features. Ethan continued immediately. "The Carter Foundation funds educational recovery grants for students forced to pause their studies because of family medical emergencies. I would like to personally arrange assistance for you and your family." Helen gasped softly beside her daughter, but before emotion could overwhelm the moment, Emily looked down briefly at the card resting in her fingers, then slowly raised her pale blue eyes toward Ethan, and what she said next caught even the billionaire completely off guard. Her voice remained soft but unwavering. "I appreciate what you are offering, but I cannot accept help simply because someone else treated me unfairly tonight." Ethan blinked once, genuinely surprised, while Emily continued with the same quiet dignity that had changed everything this evening. "Respect means more to me than money, Mr. Carter, and I do not want kindness given only because someone else failed to show decency." For the second time that night, complete silence surrounded them, but now Ethan felt something entirely different rising inside him, because standing before this young woman who had every reason to accept immediate rescue, he realized genuine character was infinitely rarer than wealth, and somehow Emily Dawson had just earned a level of admiration no billionaire fortune could ever purchase. 6 months later, the morning sunlight spilling across downtown Los Angeles carried none of the heaviness that had defined the unforgettable night inside Ethan Carter's Beverly Hills estate, because somewhere between the public destruction of false luxury and the quiet rebuilding of genuine respect, lives had shifted in ways nobody standing beneath those crystal chandeliers could have predicted. Inside the newly opened Carter Community Advancement Center, located just 3 blocks from the financial district, floor-to-ceiling windows allowed warm California light to flood across polished oak floors, where dozens of working-class families now moved through bright open spaces, receiving educational counseling, employment assistance, and medical support resources funded entirely through a foundation Ethan had quietly restructured only weeks after ending his engagement. But unlike the hollow prestige events he once believed symbolized success, this building carried something infinitely more valuable: purpose. Mounted near the entrance, a silver-engraved plaque reflected sunlight softly across the lobby walls beneath words that had become the new philosophy guiding every future decision Ethan made: dignity is never determined by status but by the courage people show when life gives them nothing except struggle. Standing several feet away reviewing a stack of scholarship applications at the central reception desk, Emily Dawson looked remarkably different than the woman who had entered Ethan's mansion wearing a simple beige dress months earlier. Her soft blonde hair now fell naturally over the shoulders of an elegant cream business blouse paired with tailored navy slacks. Confidence had replaced exhaustion around her pale blue eyes, and though financial hardship no longer controlled every decision surrounding her family, nothing about her natural warmth had changed. Nearby, Helen Dawson sat comfortably speaking with two newly hired employee coordinators while smiling in a way Ethan suspected years of relentless survival had rarely allowed before. Her husband, now receiving proper rehabilitation treatment after the Carter Foundation quietly assumed medical expenses, Emily had stubbornly refused as charity until Ethan instead created a formal leadership position overseeing scholarship operations and insisted she had more than earned the opportunity through merit alone. At that exact moment, the glass front doors opened softly and Ethan stepped inside wearing a sharply tailored midnight blue suit. Though unlike the emotionally distant billionaire who once measured life through acquisitions and strategic partnerships, something quieter lived inside his expression now. Peace earned through finally understanding success meant very little when disconnected from humanity itself. Several employees greeted him warmly as he crossed the lobby, but his attention settled immediately toward Emily, who looked up from the reception desk and smiled naturally the moment their eyes met. No awkwardness remained now because over months spent building the foundation together, respect had slowly transformed into something deeper neither had rushed nor needed to name immediately. Ethan approached casually, stopping beside her desk while glancing down at the scholarship applications spread neatly across polished wood. "How many new approvals this week?" he asked softly. Emily smiled while organizing the final folder and answered with familiar warmth, 37 families. Full tuition assistance for 11 returning students and expanded medical support funding for 8 emergency cases. Ethan nodded, quietly impressed though not surprised, because everything Emily touched somehow carried the same integrity she had revealed that unforgettable night months earlier. After several seconds she looked toward him with playful calm and asked, "Still convinced expensive rooms define successful people?" Ethan laughed softly, something few business magazines covering his empire had ever captured properly, then shook his head while meeting her steady gaze beneath warm sunlight filling the center around them. "Not even close." Emily smiled wider and gently reached for his hand resting beside the desk, fingers intertwining naturally now without hesitation, while across the lobby families continued receiving second chances built from compassion instead of privilege. And standing there beside the woman who once refused rescue simply because dignity mattered more than money, Ethan Carter finally understood the most valuable thing he had gained was never wealth itself. It was learning that sometimes the people wearing the cheapest clothes carry the richest souls in the entire room.